He had flown through radar walls, outrun guided missiles, and survived interception drills designed by some of the harshest tacticians the Soviet Air Force could produce. Yet on this winter night above the low-cloud deck of the Black Sea, Major Sergei Antonenko felt something he had not felt since his first solo sortie: the quiet, unwelcome pressure of uncertainty. His MiG-29's radar scanned the empty sky in its familiar patterns, painting clean sweeps with no returns of concern. And yet the ground controllers, usually composed to the point of indifference, spoke with a tension they were trying and failing to disguise. They warned of an American aircraft moving along a corridor it had no business flying. Sergei expected a fighter, perhaps an F-15 probing the edges, or an F-16 executing a diversion. That was the pattern. Aircraft meeting aircraft, high-performance jet against high-performance jet. But the target that finally appeared on his radar was not a fighter at all. It was slow, small, and flying low. Too low. It took him several seconds and a second look at the plotting display to accept that he was being vectored toward a helicopter. A helicopter should not have been a threat, not to a frontline fighter like the MiG-29. In Soviet doctrine, helicopters were vulnerable, support-oriented, never true air-to-air opponents. But this contact was different. The ground station's voice, clipped and tightened by stress, mentioned what intelligence officers had been whispering for years: a new class of American attack helicopter that did not simply fire missiles. It guided them with an onboard targeting suite capable of tracking, scanning, and updating in flight. To Sergei, this made little sense. Missiles were either fired and guided by the pilot or designed for autonomous homing only in narrow envelopes. A helicopter carrying weapons that could search, classify, and pursue targets independently sounded like the kind of story recruits told each other in barracks. Yet the Americans had been seen testing just such a capability. A fire-and-forget missile that used millimeter-wave radar to lock on and guide itself. A weapon unlike anything Soviet aviators had encountered. He descended through the clouds, scanning visually now. The night was moonless, featureless. Then, far below, he saw it. A dark silhouette, blades shimmering in the diffuse glow of his infrared scope. Moving slowly, deliberately, and utterly unafraid. Sergei eased the MiG-29 into a descending arc, keeping just enough altitude to retain maneuvering authority. From this position he could observe without fully committing. Every instinct told him the helicopter should have been blind to his presence. After all, Soviet fighters relied on speed, altitude, and radar advantage. Helicopters were targets, not hunters. But this one flew with a posture he had never seen before. Slow, yes, but not hesitant. Its flight path was measured, almost calculated, as if it operated inside its own bubble of awareness. His onboard warning receiver chirped, just once. A brief, ambiguous pulse. Not a missile lock, not a radar emission strong enough to classify. More like the faint edge of an active sensor sweeping past him. He frowned. Attack helicopters used infrared search and track, not radar powerful enough to touch a fast mover. But intelligence briefings had warned of something new. An onboard radar array that could scan in narrow beams, updating missile guidance autonomously even in cluttered terrain. If it was true, then this American machine, likely an early AH-64 Apache variant, possessed a capability Soviet pilots rarely associated with rotary wing platforms: autonomous fire control. Sergei steadied his breathing. The Americans had been experimenting with millimeter wave seekers, high-frequency bands capable of penetrating dust, smoke, and weather with remarkable precision. Those seekers belonged to a new missile the West called the AGM-114L. Unlike older models, which required continuous laser designation, this generation could lock onto a target, fly independently, and update its trajectory in real time. In other words, once the missile left the rail, the helicopter pilot no longer needed to guide it. Fire, forget, and let the electronics think. For a fighter pilot trained under Soviet doctrine, where the human remained the essential element in guiding a weapon, such autonomy felt unnatural. Dangerous, even. But what made Sergei uneasy was not the technology itself. It was the silence surrounding it. The helicopter did not illuminate him with search radar. It did not maneuver defensively. It simply held position, like a predator confident in its sensors. Sergei swung wide, testing its response profile. Nothing. No shift in flight path. No abrupt climb or descent. The helicopter behaved as though it already possessed the situational picture it needed. And then, as he banked past its right side, he saw something he had not expected. A cluster of launch rails angled outward, each carrying a missile with the unmistakable nose cone of an active radar seeker. They were not pointed at him. They didn't need to be. Sergei felt a tightening in his chest, a reflex born from years of flying intercept missions where every threat announced itself clearly. Soviet doctrine depended on detectable sequences: radar lock, missile launch, visual confirmation. But this machine below him operated outside that choreography. Its weapons did not require illumination. Its sensors did not shout their presence. Its pilot did not need to stare down a targeting reticle to guide a missile's final dive. This was the part that unsettled him most. The helicopter behaved as though the pilot was optional. He circled again, this time pulling closer, dipping beneath the clouds to observe from a lower angle. The helicopter's silhouette resolved sharply against the dark terrain. Twin engines, swept landing gear, a narrow fuselage with a mast-mounted sensor that rotated in slow, deliberate movements. The legendary American AH-64, but not the baseline model he had studied in briefings. This one moved with the confidence of an aircraft carrying systems that thought for themselves. His threat receiver emitted another faint tick, brief, precise, almost clinical. He recognized it now. A millimeter-wave search sweep, the kind attributed to the Longbow fire control radar the Americans had begun testing. Not a full illumination. Not a lock. Just a momentary interrogation, enough for the helicopter to update its internal picture without exposing itself. Sergei realized he was not fighting a pilot. He was fighting a process. He throttled forward, closing the distance to force a reaction. In the cockpit of a MiG-29, aggression was often the best tool. Speed and vertical maneuver allowed him to set the terms of engagement. Even a modern helicopter could be overwhelmed by a fighter's energy advantage. He dove hard. The Apache did not turn away. It did not dive for cover. Instead, the nose dipped by a few degrees. A small, almost dismissive adjustment, and something changed along its wing stubs. A flicker of motion. A shift in the sensor turret. Not toward him, but toward the sky in general, as if calculating trajectories rather than tracking his exact position. Then he saw it. One of the missiles angled slightly, its seeker head glowing faintly in his infrared scope. Not a lock, but a readiness state. The helicopter was preparing a weapon that would not chase heat or follow a painted laser line. It would chase a solution generated by its own onboard logic. Sergei's mouth went dry. He was trained to fight other men, unpredictable, fallible, limited by reaction time. But this was a weapon system that could register his movement, compute an intercept, and pursue him even if the helicopter turned away. He pulled up sharply, instinct overriding reason. For the first time in years, he felt the unmistakable chill of being prey. The MiG-29 clawed upward through a column of cold night air, its engines straining as Sergei pushed for altitude. Height meant options. Altitude meant energy. But no amount of altitude could erase the fact that the machine below him had already tasted his presence, cataloged it, and filed it somewhere inside its circuitry. He was used to fighting adversaries who relied on line-of-sight human perception and cockpit judgment. The helicopter's millimeter-wave array relied on none of that. It built a picture from reflections invisible to the naked eye, converting every surface, every contour, every movement into a track file. Sergei steadied his breathing again. The worst thing a pilot could do in an unfamiliar fight was let imagination fill the gaps. He needed data, not fear. He leveled at 12,000 meters and turned his aircraft for another pass, this time approaching from an oblique angle. If the helicopter intended to fire, it would need geometry. Even a self-guided missile required some initial spatial logic. A clean beam approach would force the Apache to reposition if it wanted a high-probability firing solution. But the Apache did not reposition. It anticipated. He saw it in the way the mast-mounted sensor rotated before he even committed to his run. The aircraft below him didn't simply react. It projected. A system like the Longbow radar allowed the helicopter to maintain target files even without visual contact, updating them as each scan returned. If his trajectory aligned with any of its assumptions, the missile could be fired in a predictive mode, a mode designed to intercept maneuvering targets. He angled away slightly, buying time. Soviet fighters had speed, but the Americans had something far more insidious: autonomy in the kill chain. A missile that didn't need the pilot to dwell on target. A seeker that could process Doppler shifts, classify a target, and adjust mid-flight without waiting for instructions. The thought alone made him tighten his grip on the throttle. Then, as he banked for a new vector, the warning receiver gave a clean, unambiguous tone. Not a full lock, a pre-lock. A momentary handshake between seeker and target. The helicopter had cued its weapon. It hadn't fired yet, but it was preparing the envelope. Sergei cursed under his breath. This was no longer a game of keeping an enemy in front of you. It was a game of avoiding the probability space where the missile could function independently. He fired his afterburners and angled sharply out of the Apache's potential cone of engagement. The night sky blurred as he pushed the MiG beyond standard intercept parameters, forcing distance, forcing uncertainty back into the machine's equations. But even as he accelerated, he couldn't shake the feeling that the helicopter still had him. Not visually, not actively, but mathematically. Sergei pushed the MiG-29 as hard as he dared, maintaining afterburner just long enough to stretch the distance without burning through precious fuel reserves. His cockpit vibrated under the strain, but the fighter responded with the raw strength that had earned it respect across both NATO and Warsaw Pact air forces. Speed was his refuge, the one domain a helicopter could never match. But this fight was no longer about speed. It was about logic. He knew the Longbow radar did not behave like the wide-sweeping search arrays of older systems. It emitted in narrow, controlled beams, generating track files that persisted even when the target maneuvered beyond visual range. And the missile that paired with it did not chase heat signatures or require the crude simplicity of early homing logic. It followed patterns: velocity, angle, rate of climb, changes in vector, all measured by microsecond-level reflections. That meant that every move he made, every burst of acceleration, every evasive roll was being fed into a computational model inside the helicopter's fire control computer. And if that model stabilized enough to reach firing certainty, the missile would leave the rail. He had to break the model. Sergei banked hard right, then abruptly pitched downward into a negative G dive that squeezed the blood from his head. His vision tunneled, but he held the maneuver. This was not an airshow trick, it was a doctrinal counter to predictive guidance. The old manuals spoke of defeating radar-guided missiles by forcing rapid changes in velocity and altitude outside their computed solution window. Against a self-guided millimeter-wave seeker, the principle was similar: shock the algorithm with chaotic movement, make the machine question its own assumptions. His threat receiver ticked again. A sharper pulse this time. The helicopter was scanning, trying to re-establish confidence in the track. Sergei pulled into a vertical climb, rolling the MiG as if tying knots in the sky. He felt the G-force clamp around his ribs like iron hands. Fighters could do this. Helicopters could not. If he kept his patterns irregular enough, the missile's logic tree might reset before launch. But even as he executed the maneuver, a chilling realization entered his mind. The Apache didn't need constant track precision. It only needed enough. Enough for the onboard seeker to acquire him after launch. Enough for the missile to think on its own. He steadied the jet for a brief moment, panting hard. The helicopter remained below, a tiny dark outline against the emptiness. Silent, patient, and impossibly calculating. It had not fired. Not yet. But it was learning him. And a machine that could learn was far more terrifying than a pilot who could guess. Sergei finally broke through the upper edge of the cloud layer, leveling the MiG-29 into cleaner, thinner air. His breathing steadied. His arms still trembled from the high G maneuvers, and his instruments flickered with the strain of rapid altitude shifts. Below him, the Apache was now a dull speck swallowed by darkness. No radar pings. No tracking pulses. No warning tones. For the first time since the encounter began, the sky felt empty. But the absence of noise meant nothing. The Americans had built a weapon that did not announce intent. He kept climbing until his fuel margin forced him to level out. Doctrine dictated disengagement. Training dictated discipline. But instinct, that primal navigator of survival, whispered that the danger had already transcended distance. This helicopter, this strange fusion of sensors and autonomy, had shown him a future he was never trained to fight. A future where machines didn't chase orders. They chased outcomes. He replayed the engagement in his mind. The predictive radar sweeps, the pre-lock pulse, the way the Apache moved as though its pilot was merely a passenger while the system itself hunted. The Soviet Air Force had prepared him for American fighters, for radar duels, for long-range missiles launched from thousands of meters away. They had not prepared him for a machine that thought, not emotionally, not creatively, but with a cold precision indifferent to fear or fatigue. He turned toward home plate, silently acknowledging the truth no pilot ever wanted to face. For the first time in his career, he had not been outflown. He had been outcomputed.